G'day art adventurers, and welcome to day 16 of Inktober 2018 with the prompt word angular. You can see here today I'm trying out something new on my channel that I've never used before on my channel, the Inktense pencils by Derwent. Now I've used them for a number of art pieces, just never in a video. They are an art medium that looks like colouring pencils, but in fact they have an ink core. And so when you add water to the pigment, initially it looks like watercolor pencils, but they will dry somewhat permanent. On the advertising, it says completely permanent, and you are able to add multiple layers, but I find that they do move a little bit. I'm also not using multiple layers in this artwork. I'm just using flat layers of 2 tones per shape. And the artwork that I'm making is another first for me. It's a self-portrait. I've never done a portrait of myself before, and I've also never done a portrait or an artwork in this style before, which is Cubism. And I've kind of taken an approach that makes the art look almost like a stained glass piece as well as a cubist modernist piece. While you're watching the speed paint, I thought I would give another little art history lesson, this time on one of the founders of Cubism, Georges Braque. Georges Braque was a French artist who was born in 1882. As a young man, he trained as a house painter and a decorator. But in the evenings, Braque would take art classes. His early paintings were impressionist in nature. Braque became inspired by other artists in 1905, and this rapidly caused a shift from Impressionism into the Fauvist movement. In late 1907, Braque met Picasso, and this interaction sparked a new direction in the works of both men. By 1908, a fascination with geometry began, creating the groundbreaking painting Houses of l'Estat. Here we see the gradual rejection of accepted painting rules such as perspective, and this was the fundamental creation of Cubism. Of course, Picasso was independently doing something very similar, and this is why both men are credited with creating Cubism. However, it is the latter person who is far and away known as one of the most famous painters to have ever lived. Cubism is today regarded as a revolutionary art movement, which examines the world in entirely new ways, beyond the scope of our reality. However, the layperson, myself included, often finds Cubist paintings difficult to enjoy and embrace. Additionally, Braque began to also employ contradictory rendering and muted, simplistic colour palettes, which forced the viewer to closely study the elements of the painting, but then also perceive these objects as both flat and three-dimensional at the same time. In short, the rejection of the rules of reality and physics can be both confusing and off-putting for many viewers. It is interesting to consider that this instinctive rejection of Cubism is not just the response of the layperson or the uneducated. Initially, French art critics universally rejected Braque's work, describing his new paintings as a series of little brown cubes, both ugly and grotesque. But one private art dealer called Daniel Kainwala suspected Braque's work had potential and gave him a one-man show. It was a roaring success. Cubism had arrived in the world. Over 100 years later, this period is now considered one of the most influential artistic movements in the history of art and man. Unfortunately for Braque, however, the credit is often solely laid at the feet of Pablo Picasso. The two artists' productive collaboration actually continued. Instead of being rivals, they worked closely together, also founding the art style known as paper collage. By 1911, the two men became so closely aligned that it even became difficult for people to distinguish if Picasso or Braque had created a painting. This continued for some time, But in 1914, the devastation of World War I had arrived in Europe, and Braque enlisted in the French army. In May 1915 of the war, he received a head injury and was temporarily blinded, one of the most horrific things for an artist to endure, and this required a large amount of recovery time. Fortunately, in late 1916, Braque could see well enough to begin to paint again, this time alone. His work continued to shift and develop. He passed away in Paris in 1963. As I said, my self-portrait is a series of firsts for me. It is my first ever self-portrait. It is my first attempt at Cubism, and it is also an attempt to highlight the Inktober prompt word of Angular. I take a stained glass type approach to the portrait, but also add cubist elements such as multiple perspectives and strange and unexpected rendering. For example, I've included 4 eyes, 2 of which look like they belong to the same eye, 2 mouths, and 2 noses. The shading is not always predictable, and there are a number of regions of muted tones where the viewer needs to carefully study the portrait in an attempt to decipher the facial features. These are all elements of Cubism, or at least that's my hope. I don't actually feel a close connection to Cubism, to be honest, and I don't feel especially successful with this piece. I guess it also doesn't help matters that I felt tired today and rushed through this whole process. I often add signature black ink outlines to my artworks to create a stark contrast in my art, and I did that in this piece too, but I don't feel that it worked. It detracts from the Cubist vibe. All in all, on reflection, I found this was an interesting personal challenge and an exercise from which I learned a lot, but it's probably not a style of art I'll be drawn towards often. The key here has been the lessons I've learned and the new experiences that I've gained. I hope other artists are using Inktober as a chance to both explore new things and also push themselves in unfamiliar directions. You can learn a lot from it. Well, that's all for today's art adventure. I hope that you enjoyed this unexpected journey. Please like, share, and subscribe if you did enjoy it, and you can also ring that little notification bell below and to the right of the video window to always be updated on when I post. And spoiler, in this case, it's tomorrow with Inktober Day 17 and the prompt word swollen. Until then, take care.